Hello, I'm Russ Kane, and you are listening and indeed watching Men's Radio Station. I'm always incredibly excited when we have a new show starting. And this is somebody that I was introduced to by a mutual friend, and we hooked up, and I thought, wow, this guy is exactly why Howard Jameson and I started this whole adventure. He's well, I'll let him introduce himself, but I'm very excited. So, this is the first in a brand new series called Shrinking the World. It's a great pleasure to introduce Dr. Raj Persaud. Hi, Raj, how are you?
Fine. Thank you very much, Russ.
Good,
So,
absolutely. Well, I'm leaving it entirely in your very capable, medical, fully qualified hands. Ladies and gentlemen, Raj Persaud.
thank you very much, Russ. Trust me, I'm a doctor. So, welcome everyone to this new program entitled Shrinking the World. My name is Dr. Raj Persaud. I'm a consultant psychiatrist. I work in private practice in Harley Street, London. I worked for many years in the National Health Service as a consultant psychiatrist, but I know what many of you are thinking when you hear now that I work in private practice in Harley Street, which is the centre of private practice, not just in the UK, but perhaps Europe and the world. You're thinking, well, he works in private practice in Harley Street. All he does all day is see nothing but supermodels and actresses. What contact has he got with the real world, with real people, with real problems? Well, as regards that allegation that all I see all day are supermodels and actresses, well, it is a tough job, but someone's got to do it. Now, I'm afraid you may hear that joke again and again every time I introduce another one of my programs here on Men's Radio Station. So the program's entitled Shrinking the World, and each week I'll have exciting, very interesting guests, and we're going to be talking about all aspects of mental health. I'm particularly interested in resilience and how people can look after themselves so they never have to end up coming to see someone like me, a consultant psychiatrist. And I'm delighted to be joined by my first guest, a chap called Michael Parker. Michael Parker has written a wonderful biography entitled My Life, My Hurdles. Michael became a bit of an advertising guru and is responsible for many campaigns, many of which you'll be familiar from on television. But he also was an Olympic level athlete, and in particular specializing in the hurdles. And there's a very interesting link between his life, his struggles, and that journey into that world of advertising and becoming a world famous advertising man, and also being an Olympic athlete. But when you hear his voice and when you hear a little bit about his life, you immediately think he's led a very privileged life. He went to a very expensive boarding school, for example. But what I find fascinating about him is that he illustrates quite nicely how you may be making a mistake if you make certain assumptions about people. If you think they came from money and they had a very privileged life, they therefore had an easy life, I think Michael's account of his life will disabuse you of that. He led a very interesting but extremely stressful life. There's almost a sense in which you get from talking to Michael that having great privilege may actually be a handicap. What do I mean by that? So let's talk to Michael. So Michael, first of all, you became a very famous advertising guru, if I can use that word. But there is a sense in which one of the very early experiences you talk about in your book is being sent off to boarding school at the age of 5. And this sounds like it was an extremely traumatic experience, a very formative experience, and something that you, in a sense, have been emotionally and mentally wrestling with for the rest of your adult life. Could you say something about that?
Yes, I mean, in any normal sense, it was a privileged life. Middle class, farming life, lovely countryside, lovely home, not wanting for anything. Particularly in wartime, when I was born, we had lots of animals and things which we could eat if necessary. The emotional privilege was rather different, because I now realize better than I did at the time, and the book has helped me that. I was sent away literally on my 5th birthday, which was May the 2nd, 1943. So for those of your listeners, that means I'm just over 83. And at that age, the other day at a restaurant, we were at supper, my wife and I, and a family had a girl who was just celebrating her 5th birthday. And she was tiny. She was being picked up and cuddled. How do you tell someone that age that you're about to be sent away? 12 weeks doesn't mean anything. You're just sent away. That's all you know. And that's what happened to me. I was told I was going away. And my father and mother put me, I was in the back in the car crying my eyes out the whole time. I knew something horrible was happening. We arrived at a great big building and a huge man said, "Hello, young man." My parents literally turned away and waved to me. There might have been a brief hug, and that was it. I didn't see them again for 12 weeks. I had no understanding what was happening, literally. I do remember that evening crawling onto the lap of a very nice matron who started reading me a story, and I said to her, "It's my 5th birthday today," and she said, "Happy birthday," which is the first time that day anyone had said it. So I was, and in my book, the artist has captured that beautifully. And in fact, when I looked at the drawing, it sort of brought back to me more immediately than I would have expected, just the sort of feelings of that moment in time. So I was emotionally, I believe, not privileged.
You've even put it more strongly than that, I think. On various accounts, you've said that you think you were abandoned, you were dumped. So, and you've been wrestling a little bit with the notion of why would your parents do that to you?
Exactly. When I first started writing, I was being helped by a very, very knowledgeable, serious novelist who'd also written a memoir. And she kept on saying to me, when you're writing a memoir, it's not what it's about or what it's really about. You have to dig for what it's really, really about. So I would first of all talk about being left. But as I thought and pondered, it was this complete bewildered sense of I've been abandoned or rejected, if you like. And so that happened at the end of each holiday. But increasingly, I also felt abandoned by the school, who would then send me back home. Because towards the end, sort of in my 7, 8, 9, I was literally felt more part of school than I did at home. But each of them was abandoning me at the end of each term or holiday. So it's 6 lots of abandonment, if you like, or rejection. It was very strange.
So this notion that the privileged upper middle classes or upper classes in the United Kingdom, dating from Victorian times, had a privileged life. They abandoned their children routinely to these expensive, private, often cruel boarding schools. There was a sense in which, although it was a tradition, that they were almost abusing their children. And what do you think about that?
Well, I think it's the word abuse is now so much more widely used across so many things, and usually rightly. I think they felt they were doing the best for their child. They did not, I think, there was not the same sort of understanding of bringing up children. They hadn't any appreciation that the family home was probably the most secure and best thing they could give to their children. And without going into the history, I suspect that, if you like, working class, as it was then referred to, because the children never left home, as opposed to people like me. Because I think the first time I was really never back at home until I was after university, because after school, I went straight into the army and then university. So most of my life from the age of 5, the majority of the time was away from home. And that is, so I did not get that sort of normal comfort and security of negotiating with a family, because they weren't there to negotiate with.
And you think that's had implications for your adult life? I think you think that, and I think you think this applies maybe to many people who've been through what you've been through, means that you found it difficult to get on with women, perhaps, or deal with long-term relationships later on in life. There was something, an echo that you think has influenced or affected your life.
I think undoubtedly. I think on the one hand, you sort of learn. I mean, I've been reading about it as well, but I was a great survivor, and you do whatever is necessary. I was lucky because I was good at sport, which undoubtedly helped you in that sort of boarding school environment, more than being, if you like, a clever boy. So that surviving, I handled it by becoming I didn't realize at the time, intensely competitive, stupidly competitive sometimes, needing validation. And it led me down a competitive route in sport. And indeed, I was very competitive in business, not as successful as I could have been, because it wasn't so much women. I found difficulty in relationships. I was actually very, very shy. I may not seem so now, but even now in a sort of social gathering, I will feel awkward, which seems silly because I got plenty to talk about and I know how to talk, but I will feel a bit of a loner. And I think that stemmed from, I don't think it made me worse with women than at the end of the day, you're likely to have a relationship with a woman, which leads rather than with a man, in my case anyway. So relationships were difficult. I would sort of want to get them started, then I would not feel comfortable in taking it to the next step. That explains a little bit.
And you think this does go back to your childhood. Now, what's interesting when you talk about this, because there's a part of the book where you're kind of bewildered, and to some extent you sound almost, you might be annoyed or angry with your parents because you're thinking, why would they do that? But then you seem to come to a more phlegmatic or philosophical view that they're just being practical. And the history of boarding schools is the empire meant that people were all over the world running the world, elsewhere from the UK. And so people had to send their children back to schools in the UK. So in a way, you've come to a view they were just being pragmatic.
I think it was a little bit of that. I think there was a snobbishness element. I think if the little school didn't have my father's laborers, if you like, were at the school, they would have found it easier to send me there. At the time, their friends were doing the same thing, sending their children away. It was the done thing. And in my case, it was the done thing that I become a farmer, because I never ever managed to talk. I think, stepping back a bit, I lost the ability to have a proper conversation with my parents from then on, and I probably never really regained it. And in writing the book, towards the end of it, because I'd had some work helping with the Foundling Museum, which the whole thing about that was looking after abandoned children. They were abandoned on the side of the road to die if they didn't go. So I wasn't like that. But it really, really made me think more that my mother was so distraught. I learnt later, each time I was sent away. I learnt it from older relatives. My father was so pleased when I was successful with the hurdling, but I never got that for either of them. I never really understood, because they were not great natural communicators anyway, looking back. My mother was a bit deaf. My father was naturally quiet. So there was a lack of any normal, if that's the right word, conversation during all of my years. I only can sort of easily recollect things after the age of 15. But before then, I'd sort of blanked out most childhood memories.
So the latest psychiatric theory is it's not so much the notion that your parents aren't bringing you up that's going to cause you trouble. It's the notion that you don't really have a caregiver. That's the key word. It doesn't really matter who the caregiver is. You connected with a matron, I think, on your first day. And I think she's the first person that wishes you happy birthday on that day, which was the day that you were abandoned, as it were, to the boarding school. But the problem is you then found the boarding school experience very cruel. I mean, there was fagging. You have to explain to a modern generation what fagging is, and there was bullying. It was a very cruel atmosphere, it sounds like, and you had to survive it.
I think this is as you know, this is a graphic memoir, and every single page is semi-cartoon style. And looking back, I think, firstly, every time I started the chapter, before the artist started work, we would have a long debate, which included what was it like? How did I really feel? And in one or two occasions, because it's graphically strong, she showed this figure of a boy being beaten, which I think for me exaggerates that sort of bullying. I was lucky. I wasn't really bullied that much. And because I was good at sport, fagging was when someone yelled fag, the prefect yelled fag, every little boy rushed to go and do his bidding. His bidding might be sit on that loose seat until it's warm enough for me, the prefect, to sit on it, that was my first ever fagging duty. But thereafter, whenever the word fag was called, because I was quick, I tended to get there before I was the one who was told, go and do that nasty bullying type duty. Equally, yes, I was beaten once or twice, and yes, there was a boy who relished in carving holes in the bottom of his gym shoe so that the gym shoe would whistle as it came down on your bottom. But equally, I had to, because I couldn't avoid it, cane people when I was a prefect. And I found that really, really hard. But I didn't have the, if you like, the ability then or the conscience to say, no, I'm not going to do this. So that was all boarding schools had it. I don't think mine, which was Repton, was any better or worse. I was not one of those, and there will always be some who seriously get abused in any sort of community situation like that. So I think I found out the caning was still going on in public schools to 1999. It was stopped in public. It was only boarding schools where not. It has stopped being used normally across the country about 20 years earlier. So the private schools were still caning 20 years after state schools had stopped doing it. So it was not. I enjoyed my school experience. I did not feel fear and trembling. These were nasty incidents, which for some, I think, scarred them forever. For me, if we're going to use the word scarring, it was being sent away so early, much more than the actual boarding school experience. So for that, me, apart from that, I learned nothing about life or sex at all. The word wasn't even used. It was frowned upon.
So I'm going to ask you a very gory question, I'm afraid. Do you remember crying when you were 5 or onwards during your childhood?
I probably don't exactly. I remained car sick because this car journey was every 3 minutes I would stop to be sick in between the crying. But in the book, there was a period of time when I was sent by a 10-hour train journey after 2 years when the boarding school moved back to the south of England. I was born in Shropshire. And the artist had found a way of showing the train journey. It goes right across the page, hour by hour by hour by hour. And I was sort of putting my thoughts under it as I'm going away and getting things. And I actually cried whilst I was rewriting that page, which is not something that I would expect to do. So it's the graphic, better than I could do. I'm now trying to tell you in words this experience. My artist working with me would bring out some of these emotional things, which I was resisting talking about. I've become better at talking about them, partly as a result of doing the memoir, partly as a result of writing the first book you mentioned on pitch coaching, which I know, as you know, that pitching is about, if people don't like you, they're not going to buy you. And I used to put that into the book. And so I was having to find ways of helping other people express themselves if they were to pitch well. And in doing that, I began to be a little bit better expressing myself.
But going back to pitching, which you became very good at, and in my opinion, life is a pitch, and a lot of people's problems often boil down to this area of being unable to pitch themselves, and you're quite right. In a way, we're all pitching ourselves. Was one of the survival instincts at school learning to get on with people? Because one of the things we know from psychiatric research is kids having a tough time become hyper-vigilant for the mental state of people who might torture or bully them. So you become very locked on to what is the mental state of the prefect today? Because if he's in a bad mood, he might beat me up. So you become much more interested in people's mental state and often quite good at detecting the mental state of others. Do you think there's any link between some of the survival instincts you had to develop in this quite tough environment and things that helped you later on in life?
I think I haven't thought of it that way. I think part of surviving, and sort of animals sort of have an antennae for danger that we don't have, is that you become, or I became, more aware of who I was dealing with and would take evasive action, if you like. Evasive action might be being nice and doing what I'm told. It tended not to be doing the opposite. I was not a bad boy at school in that sense, because I didn't want to risk being rejected. So I never sort of, I wouldn't show off or anything like that. I wouldn't do silly things because I was too conscious of not wanting to be abandoned again. And so I think as I became more into pitching, which is a competitive thing, which is why I enjoyed it, I got better and better at understanding that it's not how clever you are unless you've listened to them first. You're never going to be able to pitch to anybody unless you put yourself in their shoes, sort of more empathetic. I think the word empathy existed when I started pitching, incidentally. I mean, I'm sure it did, but it was not used quite so much. And so whether you are hoping to make an impression on someone at lunch, or I think even there's a two-way thing when you're in a restaurant. The people who really know how to wait, they just by the way they smile, they've made you feel better about the food. That is a pitch, and equally you owe it to them to sort of respond to that. So pitching is a big part of life. I mean, it really is, and I enjoyed if you like, the ultimate pitch, in the sense that pitching for business, which people are doing all over the place, not just in advertising. You either win or you don't. And I rather relish that, being put into the firing line, because in my sport, which is high hurdles, any race, you're a pitch. But if you're running a marathon, you're not pitching for 24 miles, 26 miles. It doesn't matter how you start. In sprint races and hurdles more than any, you lose the race with the starting gun, because if you don't get to the first hurdle first. So to me, that was the ultimate pitch. It was a sort of do or die, and I loved it. I really got used to. I was never nervous. I had nerves in the right sense, but one of the high points of my life would be when I was at the start of a race, just waiting for that. So the whole hour and a half beforehand, I mean, I was trying to get into that mood of sort of absolutely, I'm going to win. I didn't win as often as I would like to. Everyone loses more unless they're Usain Bolt. But that was a pitch, and I enjoyed the thrill of that. And I enjoyed, in my pitch coaching, helping get a team or a person feeling more relaxed and more able to go into that meeting, really going to give it their all. So that's part of pitching.
But I'm very interested in this notion of competitiveness, of winning. I think the fact you began to win and win early as a young man and win in elite athletics, you were an elite hurdler, you were at the Olympics. I think that may have saved you psychologically. I'm interested in your view on this, because I wonder what would have happened if you weren't winning and if you didn't have sport. And I think for men in particular, they follow a football team, men get together and discuss sports. A lot of people say it's a way of men avoiding discussing important things. I actually think in a way they're discussing important things. They're discussing it by another way. They're discussing it through sport. So I think that for men, competitiveness, winning, athletic, sporting activity plays a huge psychological role. So I wonder what your thoughts are about that.
Well, I would challenge, I think, men or women in this. I almost by accident found myself into a sport which was hurdling, which is a very, very individual sport, as is much of athletics, but hurdling somehow because of the quickness of the thing. And in the memoir I describe, because I've always told the people the story, when I was 12, I'd never ever been on, most people had never been near hurdles. I was due to take part in the usual school hurdles the next day for the first time. I had a bit of a fever and I was kept in bed, and I had a dream or hallucinated. I absolutely dreamt every single hurdle in this race, and I whizzed over it absolutely perfectly. As anyone will know, if you've never hurdled, you run towards the hurdle as a young boy, stutter, 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 stop, go back, because you don't know when to take off. I had this innate sense of timing. I could run at the hurdles almost blindfold, and I would take off from the right spot. That's not hurdling and technically, but that makes you very fast. So I won hurdles easily. And that moment stayed with me when I got older, and then I learned how to hurdle. So that one funny dream set me off in a very individually competitive event. As I started doing it more, I trained with as many men as women. In the days, most people won't remember of Mary Rand, who won gold medals in Tokyo. And she could long jump longer than I could, and I was quite a good long jumper. So I always took it for granted that they were just as competitive. So I can't speak for it being a more masculine thing. It has been, and probably men need it more, I don't know, in order to sort of validate themselves. But certainly, it's not always competing against other people, it's competing against myself, I think, as much as anything. I need to have something. For me, it is a hell of a challenge to write. My wife was a top writer at Saatchi & Saatchi. She can write 10 times better than I can. For me, it's a struggle getting the words out, partly because of this sort of difficulty to express myself, but it's a great challenge. And in just the act of trying to write the memoir, I think I've come to at least understand myself a bit better than I did before.
So this difficulty expressing yourself may have something that goes back to the trauma of boarding school. Now, after you left boarding school, you went into national service and the army, and you were bullied there. And in fact, the experiences you describe in the book sound worse, if it's possible, than what happened at boarding school. And funnily enough, it sounded like boarding school prepared you for the bullying that then happened in the army. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, it was interesting. I was called up like everyone, and you all turned up, in this case, in a barracks in Yorkshire. And the first thing you do is have your hair cut and you're injected, whatever they felt you had to be injected for at that time. And I was surrounded by 18-year-olds like me. And a lot of them were crying. And when we went to the awful barracks for the first time, there was sort of tears all night. And I realized these young guys had never left home once in their life. This was before even package holidays had started. So for them, they were having the trauma of abandonment, if you like, for the first time when they're 18. Whilst I was thinking, wait a minute, I've been abandoned like this since I was 5. I've got rid of the crying thing. However, then they did make it. They set out to sort of wear you down. I don't know how they would then describe it, but those sergeant majors and people were pretty brutal. And, you know, I did sleep under the bed at night because that was the only way you could possibly have your bed prepared for the inspection the next morning. So I was not alone in sleeping on the concrete in order to not have your clothes torn all over the place because you hadn't folded them to exactly 11.5 inches by 12 inches, with sergeants screaming at you. And making you repeat that thing. You're an effing, what are you, Parker? I'm an effing, whatever, Sergeant. You'd have to yell back at the top of your voice. So they made you feel pretty bloody miserable. There wasn't any physical abuse that I ever saw, but doing a lot of press-ups can be pretty hard. And so again, if you were vaguely sporty, it was much easier. But if you were a boy who couldn't climb up a wall, you had to go on trying to climb it until you got over it. It was pretty miserable. So they really did decide to. It's all part of this is how we harden them up. So when there's a real war, I mean, I'm not into the psychology of it, but I did remember that at that time, I was lucky enough to get through the War Office selection procedure, which allowed you to become a short-term officer, and it was run by, I think, psychiatrists, Raj, but apparently when World War II broke out, they suddenly found that most British officers just hadn't a clue about leadership, and the wrong sort of people were there because they were the second son of a wealthy family. So by the time the war had finished, they'd got quite good at identifying people who had whatever was required to manage or lead. So that was a tough 3-day thing that everybody had to go through, which then meant the rest of your army life was easy because you were an officer rather than a foot soldier. So it was pretty brutal for some. If you were not physically quite strong, I think that basic training was hell.
Now, as a psychiatrist, one of the things that strikes me about what you experienced is to some extent some of these sergeant majors about the bit where you had to fold your clothes within a millimeter, and if it wasn't correct, they would find an arbitrary reason for ruining your life. The danger of it is it attracts sadists. And you're lucky at boarding school, you didn't have that many sadists in control of your life. But if you've got a sadist who's got power over you, you're in real trouble. And in a way, I'm surprised, actually, given how much potential there was for incredible abuse or sadism, that you didn't experience more of it, actually.
I only had to endure 6 weeks of that basic training. And it was... sadism may not be the right word, but it was a sadistic experience to go through. This is how the army did it. And you've seen all those movies and things, and whether it's the American army or the British army. And of course, at the back of it was, we are preparing people who, when the worst comes to worst, can go through the trenches and all of that sort of thing. And so the perceived wisdom is you make them go through hell so that they can endure it when they have to. So I think I don't think there was a sadistic intent, but obviously there would have been some people, as there are in any major community, whether it's the police force, who take advantage of their coaching position, if you like.
Yes, just to be clear, sadism is where you take pleasure in causing suffering to others. There's causing suffering to others because you think it makes sense, or because you think there's some higher purpose being served. But there'll be a group of people that will be drawn to the kind of job where people bullied you a little bit, who are doing it because they enjoy causing suffering, and that's the dangerous thing.
Now, I think when I first had to go to the loo, and you had to go and ask for some toilet paper, and he had this great phrase: one up, one down, one for a polish. So he gave you 3 bits of paper, very small loo paper, and he relished saying that. Now, that is a small example of sadism, I guess.
Yes, yeah, I agree. Okay, so you leave the army, and you're still actually, relatively speaking, amazingly psychologically intact, it sounds like, and then you return to the farm, I think, and you can't even plow a straight furrow, and you hang in there.
That's right.
Even though it's making you miserable.
Now, I'd had Cambridge in between.
Okay.
I was tenancy farming. It's very difficult for farmers who want to keep the farm going not to pass it on to their children. All of my friends were going to be farmers. I was going to be a farmer. I never had a conversation, which my father would have. He didn't know how to introduce it to me to him. I did not like the idea of farming. However, Cambridge had an agricultural course, so that's where I went. At Cambridge, I learned nothing about agriculture. I got a degree. I did start my athletics career seriously. And so by the time I left Cambridge, I was already an international athlete. And then I'm suddenly dumped in the farm. And even to this day, I haven't had one for a few years. I would have a dream that I'm now 70, about to take over my farm from my father, and I don't know a turnip from a potato. So that was one of my dreams, that I had failed utterly. I could not connect in any shape or form with the idea of farming. But yet I did it. And so I struggled for about 6 months, and during which time I'd got married very, very quickly, a marriage which both of us were too young for. And I didn't know how to. My father knew this, but he never said to me, "Are you sure you like farming?" And so when I eventually plucked up courage, which came after plowing a field, literally, I plowed this field and all day, and I was thinking, God, this is boring. I hate this. And I suddenly said, I'm going to pluck up courage and say to my father, I can't farm. He wasn't surprised. And yet we'd never have a conversation. And to be fair to him, he did everything to help me get going on a new career, which was advertising, simply because when I went and asked the old tutor at Cambridge, he said, there is this thing called advertising. They don't seem to mind whether you've got a degree or not, which I did have in farming.
And so you went into advertising. We'll talk about
that. I went into advertising.
Yeah. But
Well,
but before we get into that, I just want to make a point here, which is that you had a very expensive boarding school education. You went to Cambridge and you were in the army. And what you're telling us is most of it was a complete waste of time. You didn't really learn anything at school. You didn't really learn anything at Cambridge, and you didn't really learn anything in the army. But you still came out of it. You still came out of it an Olympic level hurdler, and that was about it. I think it's fascinating how this country has managed to survive when so much of what happened to you, for example, and you had an elite experience, was a complete waste of time.
yes, no. The
Right.
yes, in terms of learning, it was a waste of time.
Yes.
And it was not that I was not academic, and I'm quite a good problem solver, but the yes, I had learned to be very competitive and how to handle situations. And I have a slightly inventive streak, not much. I had a great grandfather who built the first electric car in this country, literally 1884. He should be up there with Tesla and the rest. His inventive streak did not pass down to me, but I'm quite good at sort of creative problem solution. And so I found my way into advertising, which, if you like, suits the creative problem. I wasn't the creative side of advertising. And also my competitiveness helped me. I don't think my Olympic status helped me at all, because when I said to my then boss of an agency, I've been selected to go to the Olympics, he said, well, you'll have to take unpaid leave, which was his only response to it.
Yeah.
So on the
Helpful.
one hand, I was competing in the Olympics. On the other hand, agencies then were run by ex-army people, and the first 2 years was like basic training in the army. I spent 6 months carting heavy print blocks from the middle of London to Fleet Street. I mean, this is someone who would, in today's terms, be seen as a graduate trainee, and I was a graduate trainee, but that's how they were treated. And so they were trying to grind me down, just like the army sergeants, before they would dare let me near the front line of a client.
But is the theme about obedience? Is that what this country was really about? They wanted a bunch of people who were obedient, because that seems to be ultimately what they were after. They were not after creativity or innovation or intelligence, it sounds like to me.
I think certainly the army at that stage, just that first 5 weeks, was obedience. The moment I went to the army training college is probably the first time I ever got any vague lessons about life, about managing people, about solving problems. So, if you like, the other ranks was about obedience, but they did realize that the officer class, if you like, needed something rather more than that. And I think at school, there was an element of obedience. And for me, sport came first and education came second, if I call it that. I think I didn't see that as obedience at that time. The army, yes, to start off with, definitely. And my first training in the agency world was a kind of, we're going to take this guy down a peg, so what, he's Olympic, so what, he was an officer. As far as we're concerned, he's mail and messengers, which is a waste of time, my time and theirs, but that's how it was.
So let's talk a little bit about your Olympic career. So you did represent the United Kingdom in the Olympics. Tell us a bit about that, and tell us, because I mean, you in a way, this is a long before the kind of support that athletes have today. You were kind of doing it by yourself, largely speaking.
Yes.
And it's fascinating, again, the tough conditions that you survived in order to make it to the Olympics. Tell us a bit about that.
Well, firstly, this was the world of the amateur. The Olympics didn't go professional till the 80s. I didn't do anything until I came out of the army. At the army, I was officer in charge of all sports, and I think I hurdled once a year. Before I went up to Cambridge, I thought I'd better have a go and see if there's any sport I'm good at. I found myself to a track I'd never been to before, and I met someone who was really important in my life, my coach, who was then coaching the world's top sprinter. There was no one else in the stadium. And I asked him, I told him what I was doing. He said, let's have a look at your hurdle. And said to me, literally, as he puffed his pipe, you can't hurdle a lick, but I can teach you. And I thought, great. And he taught me. And I must have had some aptitude because I learnt the technique of hurdles unbelievably quickly. I went up to Cambridge doing, let us say, 17 seconds, maybe 16. In the next summer, that summer, I was in contention for the British 60 Olympics. I'd gone down amazingly in speed. And so I had a natural aptitude and a brilliant coach. Those two things together suddenly put me on the path to Olympic. So I was pitching for the first Olympics, not even hadly dreamt of it the year before. I just missed it by a tenth of a second. And I spent, looking back, every evening after a hard day's work, I would train usually on my own in Hampstead Heath or somewhere. In the winter, you would run up hills because there were no indoor tracks. Sometimes I'd have to take myself off to Crystal Palace, where I would personally have to get the hurdles out of the locker room because there was no one else there. And so I was training on my own. And so this sort of loner idea, which has slightly come up in other things, I'm not a naturally gregarious person, but I stuck at it. And I became so much better than I could ever have imagined. And I did hold the British record for 6 years in hurdling. Now it's the magic time barrier, it's 13 seconds. Then it was 14 seconds. I got under 14 seconds in the first time Britain had done that. And so relatively easily qualified for Tokyo, which was both the worst and the best moment of my life. In terms about the sprezzatura, on that first, I haven't mentioned sprezzatura, but there's this, I'll come back to it if we need to, a moment of elation when you're competing, you're out of your skin. In the first heat, pouring rain, horrible, I ran so well. I can't even remember if there's anybody in the stadium. I won. My time then was the fastest in the world. The next day was the semi-final when I was against the two people who really were the fastest in the world on being the gold and silver medalist. And I nearly beat them to the first hurdle, but didn't, just clipped it. So that was the worst day of my life because suddenly I went from possibility of the final to not in it. And I kind of took myself off to a bar and spent some time with a Japanese young woman who I'd met before. I did not dwell ever on defeat very long. If you're a racer like that, you're always going to be beaten more often than you win. Otherwise, you'll be Usain Bolt. So unless you can get used to handling defeat, there's no point being a competitive athlete. Because I would always look forward to this next race with absolute relish. I'm going to win. Then I wouldn't, but that was all right. I soon got out of it. So that was a high point in my life. I was hurdling really well. I was the top 10 in the world. I was working long hours. I mean, I was working normal hours to, let's say, 6:30 at night. I would train in the evening. There was one noticeable occasion that they were so proud of my achievements, the agency, that I was competing against Germany in the White City then. And I said, can I have half an hour? Can I leave half an hour early? No, you can't leave till this plant meeting's over. And I was allowed to leave from central London with 30 minutes before my race. I changed in a black cab, which parked on the pavement. And I just managed to get to the starting line holding my blocks. And I won by a mile because I was so full of energy. But this was when they were not interested. You know, you're representing your country. So what? We've got a client here.
Right. Okay. So you said the Japanese girl is a hint that this was the Tokyo Olympics you're referring to.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
Okay. And then was it the Mexican Olympics after that?
Yes.
Okay. And you competed there?
I competed there, but then my goal was to get there. By then, I was no longer a top 10 in the world. I was in the top 50. I knew that I would be lucky to get through a heat, which I didn't. But then I was able to enjoy myself. And again, as it happens, met with a delightful person who we went off for 2 weeks. The Olympics then went on forever for wrestling and boring things like that, which I wasn't interested in. And had a gorgeous time on the beach near Acapulco. So there was this kind of it did seem like I'd repeated the Tokyo experience. It was only in the sense that I know if I'm lost, I'm lost, and I stop worrying about it. That was yesterday. I just get on with something else. In this case, I was lucky.
But with the Mexican Olympics, your picture appears on a poster that was used to
Yes,
advertise the Olympics.
that's right. I didn't know about this until my wife, about maybe 15 years ago, was shopping in New York with our daughter, our older daughter, and it was my birthday coming up, and they went to they have some huge poster shops in New York, and they're wandering around, said maybe something Olympics, and they found this one. And if you see it, it's a blurred photograph deliberately, because what they're trying to show is the hurdles, which have been, as it were, redone as the famous Olympic logo of the time. But it is me. So that particular shot was used worldwide just after the Olympics, advertising the movie of the Olympics, because then television was not nearly so available worldwide. So I didn't come across that photograph until 20 or 30 years out. I never knew it existed. I've since seen it in books, and I thought I had to find a way of getting it into the memoir. It's too good not to have it, but to actually have one of the original posters as a birthday present. I know it's me. I know it. I know my style of hurdling. I know I was on the outside. I know I wasn't winning. I was losing in that race.
But although it's a blurred picture, you are actually the athlete that's nearest the camera.
Yes, that's right.
It's your picture that actually
yeah.
is advertising the Mexican Olympics.
Sure.
And there's an image that went around the world. And
Yeah.
it's an irony because you worked in advertising.
I know. So every Olympics, I kind of looked at with an advertising eye. I mean, the Tokyo Olympics was when all those famous Japanese companies now, like Sony, first appeared. The Japanese used it as an advertising platform. Mexico were trying to do the same. It wasn't helped because there was a student massacre, which we never heard about, which I refer to in the book. They did a beautiful Olympics. I mean, it was just beautifully done. But they didn't link it to the same way to commercial success as the Tokyo at that time did. But of course, it's a showcase to the world. Now it's got too big, and I'm not comfortable personally with the way the IOC operates. I think what's happening in China is a travesty. I just think the event has become too big and too commercial, and the countries that run it are then a slave to the Olympic organization.
Well, so there's a lot of politics has crept in as with the money, and we'll talk
Yes.
about that maybe a little bit later. But let's go back to this very important point. What's unique about hurdles, as I understand it, you know much more about this than I do, is as a race, once the gun goes, it's the first person to the first hurdle that basically has won the race. So the race is over within the first few yards.
Almost, because the race is interrupted by the 10 hurdles, there's a sort of cadence to the race. And if you take off a little bit behind, you can sort of see it over the hurdle. And so the person who gets the first hurdle almost always will have an advantage. Clearly, when they are very, very similar, and mostly people are when they're at the top level, no one person wins every single time. But if you don't get a good clearance, you slightly miss your takeoff, then the whole of your momentum will have been interrupted. So in 100 meters, you sort of watch the sprint race unfold over the first 30, whereas in the hurdles, you sort of see it unfold over the first hurdle, which is only 15 yards on from the starting line. So I rate listening for the gun and starting with the gun even more important. And it's a huge sort of, it's an amazing kind of feat of concentration, how many sprinters do not full start. Now, if they make one full start, they're out. In my day, you could do one full start and have another chance. But it's a real moment of truth.
Well, yeah. Well, not only is it a moment of truth, it's an incredibly high pressure moment.
Yes,
and I'm fascinated that you kind of relished it. You thrived.
I did.
It didn't bother you.
I started relishing it the night before, as it were. I stopped worrying if I didn't sleep, because I knew the adrenaline would always because once I used to worry about I can't sleep. I'm thinking about it, not out of fright, just simply the nervous energy that you're getting together. But no, I found it a really electric moment, and I loved getting to the competition, getting ready. The warm up was a really ritual, and sort of every athlete has their own. But some athletes left it on the training track. And that is an expression. Don't leave it all on the training track. Some athletes who I trained with would beat me regularly in training, but not in competition. So in that sense, I was lucky. I competed and loved it.
Do you not think there's something hugely psychological about that? They could beat you training, but not at the key moment.
I'm sure there is. I think somebody at work once said to me, "You're the most competitive individual I know." Not the most successful individual, but I'm always competing, and I am. And even now, when my wife will say, "Oh God, stop competing."
Okay, but this idea of the pressure and the stress of you relishing it, I think is really interesting. I wondered if you think anything about your background led to that, but it sounds that it was completely self-initiated. But do you miss it? And how do you replace that? Because a lot of athletes go off the rails, as you know. They get into drugs and alcohol and all sorts of things precisely because they're trying to replace that adrenaline that they cannot replace.
If you were as poor a natural writer as I am, the challenge of writing is a form of replacing it. It really is. To the great writers, I mean, all writers have their own things, but I really do struggle. And we'd call it a constipated style of writing in my family, because I'm surrounded by people who write brilliantly and naturally and quickly. So for me, it's a real challenge to get this onto paper. And that has partly replaced the sense of competition. And I'm sure it is. I need a challenge.
So you went into advertising, and many campaigns that many slightly older people will be familiar with. The Milky Bar Kid, the Milky Bars are on me. Cyprus, the Love Island. Very interestingly, before we met, you didn't know this. I actually visit Cyprus 3 or 4 times a year. It's my favorite holiday destination. And we've been doing that for about 20 years. I have no idea whether I've ended up visiting Cyprus because of your campaign. You came up with the campaign, Cyprus, the Love Island. So, and other famous campaigns as well. Tell us a little bit about that, and tell us a bit about the psychology of pitching and how that is part of what life is about.
Okay, well, I'll tell you the wrong kind of pitch. The last time I pitched for Cyprus, 6 agencies have been invited. We've been told to send off our pitch presentation in advance, duplicates of 12, well packed up. And this is going to be a really professionally run pitch by the client. We turn up in their headquarters in Nicosia. We're asked to wait about an hour and a half. Food trolleys are being passed in and out while we're waiting, and eventually we're shown in, and they were all smoking cigars and chatting amongst themselves. The board of the Cyprus Tourist Office, I think it was all men. There was sitting on the table were our piled unopened presentations, which they were meant to scrutinize, and then we go our presentation. Quite clearly, they have already made their mind up, so I sit and present to them. That was not my best pitch. Later on, every agency sued them for having wasted their time by asking them to pitch when a decision had been taken. But the psychology for me was I relished again. It's the equivalent of the chase. Then there were pitches which just happened on the spur of the moment, but all would have in common the kind of having to try and understand who it is that you're pitching to, how the decision, and all of those sort of things. So I would go into Michael Parker mode of trying to understand what I could best do, part of the team, and I relished that. And so some pitches would take a year. Perhaps the most interesting was one where I was in charge of this at Saatchi's, and somebody arrived in the door who looked like a character from a James Bond movie, the sort of Smersh type character, sort of Slavic features, beetle-browed, and who kept on rubbing his finger and thumb together, doing the sign of money. And he wanted me to persuade Coca-Cola that he could he was in charge of the space agency in Russia, and they were ahead of us at that time. He would paint the Coca-Cola bottle on his next rocket going up, and when we explained that it would be burnt off as soon as it happened, he sort of went away, and then he got sent over to Moscow on a tit-for-tat spy scandal. He was sent back to Moscow, and then 2 years later he reappeared, still doing finger and thumb. Only this time, bizarrely, he had some money, and he wanted to find for him the first 2 Britons to be trained to go into space. He didn't want to go through the army or the government, and that was his brief. Recruit for me someone to go into space. So this was an odd brief from someone who I was having to speak to through an interpreter. But I said yes, and I then went back and talked to a very clever creative team. And we said, well, it's a recruitment ad. Let's write a recruitment ad. Now, old-fashioned print recruitment ads say, waitress wanted, no experience necessary. So they wrote, astronaut wanted, no experience necessary. With lots of cop, we ran it as full pages then when all the newspapers were broadsheet, not small, Times, Sunday Times, etc. Just once, we gave it a name, Project Juno, and 13,000 coupons came in, replying they want to do it. 5,000 of those were given another thing. 300 were then selected. 3 people were trained, and one of them, Helen Sharman, was the first Briton in space. So this was it was a brilliant advertisement, which is not mine. Mine was just, as it were, landing this strange character who kept on finger and thumb to me. So that was a pitch. If I hadn't listened to him, literally in the reception, I just said, well, this guy, I think he's just, is not to be trusted, which he probably wasn't. So that was a pitch, which I was very, very proud of because it was such a beautiful result. And so Helen Sharman was the first Briton in space.
So let's come up with some life lessons for people listening. So one is don't focus on defeat. Defeat is defeat. Yep. Move on. Think about the next race. Don't dwell on the race that you just lost. Listen very carefully to what the other person's saying. Try to figure out what it is that they want or need. Any other life lessons from your rich and colorful life?
I think be kind to yourself and to others. I think what I've learned through doing this is that whilst I still have problems of abandonment, I now kind of work them out much more quickly, and they don't upset the rest of the day. I have every now and again unbelievably vivid abandonment dreams. I am the only person left in an airport. I am the only person left in the hotel. Everyone else has gone. I mean, it's that sort of vivid. But I've now learned sort of, wait a minute, think it through, put it to one side, and just get on, and not allow it to drag me down. I don't think you ever change totally from the way you sort of developed. But I am much more at terms and understanding it, and therefore I sort of accept myself much better. And I think I'm an easier person to get along with. My wife might not always agree.
But of all the bad things that happened to you, including what your parents did to you and so on, in my opinion, as a psychiatrist, you're remarkably not angry. You're remarkably philosophical about it all. A lot of people would be angry and dwell on the anger and ruminate that you've been badly treated. Some of the anecdotes you told where you're meant to get to a race and the advertising agency says, no, you've got to stay. People would be angry about that. You're not angry at all. How did you achieve that?
I think had I had this conversation with you 20 or 30 years ago, when I got myself into a number of relationships, I was good at getting into them. I was bad at carrying them on or getting out of them. So I was wooing well enough. But then I would get into fear of rejection. And I really made a mess of my relationships with people. I'm still not, we all make mistakes and things. But then I think if you would ask me, was it anger? It probably was. Now I've gone through the other side of it. Why should I be angry? I have compared with many, a really nice life. I do better understand
I have to
those
say,
things.
gentlemen, this has been the most fascinating hour. I could talk to you, Michael, for another hour easily. You resonated in ways you can't even begin to imagine. What a brilliant first show in this new series. Michael Parker, thank you so much. What a legend you are. And just finding that poster in New York, what's the blooming chances of that? Dr.
I
Raj
know.
Persaud,
Thank you.
welcome to Men's Radio Station. What a fabulous first show. Absolutely loved it. Thank you both so very much. This is Men's Radio Station. I'm Ross Kane. Until the next time, stay